So, good morning. For those that weren't in the room, I am Graciela Martinez. I am the head of the CERT of LACNIC. LACNIC is the internet registry for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I am chairing this session, and I would like to give some quick reminders before starting it. This talk is TLP white. Please silence your devices. The question and answers will be at the end of the session. We have the microphones in the aisle, and your opinion is very important to us, so please don't forget to fill out the session survey in the mobile app. And now I would like to introduce Anthony Adams from Monash University, Australia. Please welcome to Anthony. And he is going to talk about cybersecurity maturity in the Pacific Islands, integrating CERT services in a regional framework. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go on.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks also to FIRST for the opportunity to speak. I'm very grateful. I'd like to say just at the outset that these are my personal views and my personal work, and whilst Monash University supports me, it's not their official position. So I need to make that clear. Okay, a very brief introduction. I have a lot to talk to, and I want to use the time really carefully. So my name's Tony Adams. I'm a PhD candidate at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, with the Department of Software Systems and Cybersecurity. We do a lot of work in the Pacific Islands region, which for people in Australia is part of they're our neighbours, our next door community. So we do a lot of work building capabilities and supporting the Pacific Island nations, which I'll talk to briefly. Okay, I'm going to talk about the problem that my research is trying to solve. I'll introduce the Pacific Island regions and talk quickly about why we work in that area, why it's important to us, the scope of my work. I want to talk about an initial conceptual model that we're putting forward for a shared cybersecurity framework across the Pacific Islands region. I'll touch briefly on our first study that we've completed in this area, which has been used to test the framework. And then I'll show you some very brief updates and talk about what we're doing next. Okay. The problem that we're talking about here, that we're trying to solve, I'm asking a couple of simple questions. What's the problem that we want to address? Who's impacted? Why should we be thinking about this? And how does this work contribute to a solution? Okay. I should say at the outset, for all the technical people here, I'm sorry, I'm technically illiterate. So you'll just have to bear with me. I don't have a technology background, and you'll pick that up pretty quickly. The problem that we're trying to address here is that in the Pacific Islands region, most of the countries are on the very early start of their journey towards developing cybersecurity, self-reliance and maturity. There's organic collaboration between teams and between nations, but they don't have an organised, integrated, regional approach to meeting their cybersecurity needs, whether it's people, processes, technology. There's nothing structured. In 2016, there was an attempt to create, well, I shouldn't say an attempt, there was a Pacific regional CERT created, which didn't last. For various reasons, PAC-CERT is no longer in existence. So at the moment, the only collaboration between nations is organic rather than structured. Who's impacted? The Pacific Island nations, people who live and work there, governments, visitors, residents, companies, etc. But people who also come to the region from outside. And for people in Australia and New Zealand, this is very important. Everyone who does business in the Pacific Island region is impacted by this broad issue. Visitors, tourists, partners, etc. Why should we address this? Well, in some of the early discussions that we had with cybersecurity practitioners in the Pacific region, they called out two significant problems. They recognised that the lack of a a regional collaborative approach to cybersecurity maturity in the Pacific means that they're all vulnerable to cyber attack. Also, this creates a handbrake on investment, if you like. People are unwilling to invest in the region or to set up business, etc., because of that inherent business risk. Those are the questions or the problems that we're trying to address here. The work that we're doing here is going to produce two things. Firstly, it'll produce a theoretical model for how we can build a collaborative, shared cybersecurity framework for low-income nations, using the Pacific Islands as a model, but a framework that we can apply to other areas where we have small, low-income, underdeveloped and under-resourced countries. Secondly, we'll translate that into a working toolkit. What we'd like to be able to do is say to teams that are going into these countries to do CMMs or to do interventions, we'd like to offer a toolkit which points to areas that they can focus on to get the best results, where they can invest their resources in the most appropriate places to get the best return, both for them and for the country involved. Okay, the Pacific Island region, I'm looking at the 25 member countries of the Pacific Islands Forum. That's a convenient way for us to put some boundary around this work. Those nations are sorted into 3 sub-regions: Micronesia, Melanesia and Polynesia. They each have a lot in common, but they have differences both economically, socially and culturally. Within those 18, did I say 25? The 18 member nations, there are a group of particularly disadvantaged nations, and they have a status within the Pacific Islands Forum of SIS, small island states. We'll touch on that a little bit further on. So this is the area that we're working in. We're working with a number of these countries around the initial study and the initial model, and we'll run some tests and some case studies with some of those nations across each of those 3 sub-regions. Okay, gosh, I'll talk quickly now. This is the bit that's not quite so interesting. I'm going to run through the research aim, questions and objectives. Lots of text, no pictures, sorry. Okay, research aims. What I want to do through this research is I want to understand how low-income nations, using the Pacific Islands region, how they can prioritise and align their cybersecurity capabilities within a multi-stakeholder regional model. In other words, countries in the Pacific that are under-resourced at the beginning of their learning curve with low maturity and low capabilities, how do they select the services that they want to invest in and develop for themselves? How do they choose the services that they want to manage themselves, the services that they want to put into a shared model across the region, who do they want to collaborate with, and which services don't matter to them, are not a priority? Okay, so I want to understand those. The questions that I want to ask are 3. How do the Pacific Island nations choose the services that they want to set up for themselves, given their circumstances, in a multi-stakeholder regional framework? How are those choices impacted by a set of national drivers, national policies, national issues around investment, capability, maturity, etc.? And how are those choices impacted by the way that they engage within their region? Some of these nations Kiribati might have 10,000 people across a number of islands spread over hundreds of kilometres. How do they engage with a region where they have very poor infrastructure? That's the challenge that we've got to try and solve. The objectives here, okay, we want to come up with a conceptual model, a theoretical framework for how a group of small, low-income nations can collaborate across a regional framework. We want to understand how those CERT services are distributed at the moment across the Asia-Pacific region, which is a bit broader. We want to look at how countries in Asia are doing this and whether we can learn from that. We want to look at the impacts of national drivers, policy drivers, government priorities, etc., and also regional approach. What does a regional approach look like with regional priorities and etc.? Okay, in the initial conceptual model, I like this, it's a bit more interesting. The foundation for our conceptual model is built on three things, three pillars I call them. The form and function, so a regional framework will be built on the policy priorities of the member nations. I find this really interesting because it means that a Pacific Island nation will invest or participate in a regional framework based on its national priorities. It'll put its national interests first and foremost. It's looking for self-reliance, and it'll invest in things that matter most to it first. Now, the way it chooses to do that will impact on what a regional framework looks like. A country like the Fiji, which is relatively well off, will take a different approach to a regional engagement to Kiribati or Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia. Domestic priorities will override the regional priorities. So the countries will be involved in a regional framework with their own interests first, and then the regional interests will always come second because they just don't have the resources to do otherwise. But they'll collaborate on issues of shared interest. So the countries recognise that they don't have the resources to do everything themselves. They'll do the things that are most important for themselves, and then they'll work with regional partners on the issues where they have shared interests. That's a really important thing. Previously, we've seen with interventions, etc., that have not worked as well as we'd like, that we put a one-size-fits-all approach, and we say, we're going to put this solution in place for these countries. Everyone will have it the same. Hasn't worked. The countries will look for their own interests first, and then they'll share and collaborate with things where they have shared interests. Okay, I've touched on this. I'll skip past this slide. All right, I'll talk quickly. The conceptual model, the foundations are, we'll have a network of affiliated, independent national CERTs. The capabilities of those CERTs will be aligned to their national interests, first and foremost, and they'll collaborate on other interests where they have shared interests. There's a role for external partners, NGOs, etc., universities and so on, to provide support that targets the national priorities. So a country like Tonga will look for material support to invest in a particular issue that meets its domestic priorities. And there's a role for FIRST or for ITU or for other groups to support that. That support shouldn't just be given because we want to be altruistic. The support should be given based on sound, solid planning and internal governance. What's really important to me is that those 4 points came from Pacific Island practitioners. So Pacific Island practitioners came to me, in fact a gentleman in Kiribati, and said, don't just give us money because we've seen this in the past. What we need is money that helps us deliver particular things based on solid planning and solid governance, which to me is really, really interesting. Okay, the initial conceptual model here that I'm putting forward has 3 key themes. What it says is that countries will participate in a regional framework. They'll work together based on a set of national drivers, national issues that matter, regional issues that matter, and global issues. The global issues we see tend to set best practice. You must have a functioning judiciary. You must have stable society. These global best practices. The areas that I'm focusing on over the next couple of years are around those regional and national drivers, because they're the ones where you get slight differences between countries in those sub-regions and countries themselves. They have with their different priorities. Okay. When I look at the 3 themes, the national, regional and global issues, they're linked together, you'll see this on the next slide, by a couple of enablers. And we'll talk through those. Okay. The picture up on here is the initial model that I'm putting forward. The three circles, I won't go through all the details. The three circles represent the three sets of influences. The national, from the bottom right, the national drivers through the regional engagement and to the global best practices at the top. The little overlap areas are the enablers. If I look at national governance, what that tells me is that's a set of issues that link the way that a national government chooses to engage with global best practices. The way that the national governance issues, how closely a national CERT is aligned to the federal government practices and funding and so on. Those governance issues impact how it chooses to adopt best practices versus how it chooses to work by itself. The second enabler, aligned CERTs, that tells me that represents a group of CERTs that work in a regional environment, that engage regionally with global best practices. So CERTs working within the Pacific Islands region will work with global best practices in a certain way that they'll work out themselves. That's what the aligned CERTs enabler is. The one that sits at the heart of my research for the next few years is the one in red, which is the CERT services. And this is where I'm looking at what are the national influences, whether they're internal architecture, internal governance, critical infrastructure, and capability maturity. How do they impact the way that a government engages with the region and chooses the services that it wants to deliver? The services that Kiribati will choose to deliver will be different to the services that Tonga or Papua New Guinea will choose to deliver. Why? Because those national drivers are different. They're in different places with their critical infrastructure ownership, they're in different places with their capability maturity, and they're able to engage with that regional framework in different ways. The bit at the centre, the CERT services, sits at the heart. The two questions that I'm answering are how does the regional engagement impact the way that CERTs operate in a collaborative framework? And how do the CERT's national drivers impact the way that it engages regionally? Okay, I'm not going to talk through all the intricate details of this, but what I want to say here is that this is the theoretical framework that sits behind the model. I mentioned at the start that I'm not a technologist. I don't pretend to be. What I'm talking about here is using an activity theory to model the way that a CERT operates within a regional environment by looking at the national governments, the CERT services, the global best practices, the regional framework and the national drivers. Those 6 points on that triangle represent 6 influences that all collaborate in a multi-dimensional, multi-layered approach that we capture using activity theory. Specifically, I'm going to be using cultural historical activity theory, which comes out of the 1920s psychology work that was put forward by a Russian chap called Vygotsky. And it puts forward a number of propositions about how we create knowledge and how we learn. We don't just create knowledge and learn things by reading a book. The book helps us, but what we learn is influenced by the cultural background that we come from, what's important to us, the rules that society put on us, etc. All of this matters because all of those 6 points work together in this multi-dimensional framework to decide or to demonstrate how the national CERT will choose to operate and put forward services based on all of these other issues that we've spoken about. So on the model there, I've got listed a couple of contradictions. Contradictions here are not problems. Contradictions here are opportunities to expand and to change the model. So part of the work here, this is based on a dialectic materialist ontology which is put forward by Marx and Hegel. What it means is that all of these issues are constantly in tension. And it means that if we look at those issues that are in tension, under tension, we can find opportunities for improvement and growth. And that's the objective here. How do the bottom left-hand triangle point there? How do those national drivers impact the CERT services? There's a point of tension there because different countries do it differently. How does the regional framework, that regional community, impact the CERT services? There's a point of contradiction there, a point of tension that we can focus on and understand better. Okay. If we do that across different countries, we get this model where we have different organisations overlapping. The bit in the middle, the circles in the middle are the really interesting part because that's the shared model across the region. Each country represented by the interactive triangle. Where they overlap, that's the area of shared interest, shared services. They're the CERT services that they choose to collaborate on versus the services that they choose not to. So the model that I'm putting forward looks at all of these components, how they interact, how they overlap. The end objective here is that by understanding how each of these small countries works and provides how they feed into this model, we can understand which areas, when they change, when they're under tension, if we can change those through intervention or through investment or whatever, we change the bit in the middle, the shared collaborative space. If we change the way that Samoa chooses to invest in threat detection, then we change the way that it collaborates across the region in the middle there because it brings a different set of knowledge and a different set of expectations and priorities and skill set, maturity, etc. Okay, I'm nearly done. The first study we did over the last 6 months was to test this initial model and to see, rather than just being academic, does it kind of make sense? Does it resonate? So we've spoken to a number of people, for 10 participations from around the world to say, does this kind of work? Mostly it does. There are some bits that we're stepping away from, and there are some bits that we'll focus on with more intensity, some bits that matter more. We know that all of these countries are interested in key services: threat detection, incident response, forensic analysis, advisory service. Community awareness was a really interesting one. All of them see themselves as having a role to play in building community awareness. The key themes that these countries all put forward: trust is an enabler of success. They want to focus on people, not technology. National CERTs have a role in raising community awareness. National CERTs, they want to support national priorities and areas of shared regional interest. And partners have a role in helping to build cyber resilience across the region. These are the key themes that the participants of the first study put forward. So what does that mean for the model? When we update this, I'm looking at the highlighted bits because that's the really interesting part for the next couple of years. The highlighted bits tell us that at a global level, everyone's interested in international norms. And we heard Wendy talk this morning about international norms as being, they set standards of behaviour or interaction that we expect. What this model tells us, and the theoretical background, is that norms are not fixed. Norms represent a point in time, and they can be expected to change over time. So I want to explore that a little bit more. At a regional level, everyone was interested in how they integrate with other teams, whether we can have structured integration or organic integration, etc. So we'll focus on that more. At the national level, what was really, really interesting was capability maturity. All of the participants are focused on capability maturity and building the core capabilities. We don't have an answer about how to do that, but it's an area that all of these Pacific Island nations are looking for support to do. And by extension, I expect that other low-income nations in other areas around the world will have a similar view. Finally, what this means is that my first question: how do the Pacific Island nations choose the CERT services that they want to support versus the services they're not interested in versus the services they want to share across the region is remains relevant, and we'll focus on that. The question around national drivers remains relevant. All of the participants talked about that. That mattered to them. The third question around how they engage regionally and how that impacts the services wasn't quite so interesting to them. So we'll keep that in the study, but it's not an area that we'll focus on. I'm just not convinced there's the appetite for that. The way that we're doing this final slide, we've built the initial conceptual model through looking at previous research around the world, previous literature, etc. We've completed this first study just to validate it, see if it makes sense. The next step, which we're starting now and will run over the next 6 months to 2 years, will be a series of case studies with Pacific Island nations. I mentioned earlier those 3 regions and the small island states. We'll be working with a nation from each of those 3 regional areas: Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. But we'll also work with one nation from that SIS group. These are the particularly disadvantaged nations who will have their own really unique perspective. Another thing that Wendy said this morning resonated with me, and this was this idea that we have like a social contract. When we're dealing with these really poor countries, that's paramount, absolutely important. So that's where we are now. We've put forward the initial conceptual model. We think that there's a lot of opportunity to identify areas for investment, for focused intervention, rather than a vanilla approach to all nations. This model will help us see for each nation what matters to them and where we should be focusing and how that fits together into a regional framework that makes sense. I'll skip past this slide. There's too much detail and I'm out of time. So finally, once again, I'm Tony Adams from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Thanks for your time. Thanks for so many people attending, way more than I expected, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So, do you have any questions for Tom? Yes, please. Go ahead.
Is this working? Yeah, Ted Normanson from CCCS. As you're bringing up Wendy, I'm thinking the same thing as I'm going through this, but how applicable is this to some of the things she was bringing up about businesses, organizations that are also poor, the federations of healthcare or other types of things which are similar to the groupings that you've done with countries? Do you contemplate the same thing when you're listening to her speech or in some of the research that you're doing?
Yeah, I was really impressed by what Wendy said this morning. When I came here, I was thinking about applying the model to countries with partners being, vendors or universities or etc. But over the last couple of hours, and in answer to your question, I'm also thinking about applying the model to partners themselves. And our partner could be a network of providers. My focus is on the countries, but a network of service providers working together in a region. That's really interesting, and I absolutely think that I should be applying this sort of thinking in that sense. So, yes, the answer is yes. We should do it.
Coming from the national CERT perspective, we have to support a lot of those kind of organizations in a country, and we're also thinking of how do we support other countries? So
how do you identify what they actually want and what's going to add value? Like rather than just throwing your money and time at everything, what are the key things that they need that you can add most value to? That's what I'm interested in.
And where can we find the progress in your research?
I don't want to sound like I'm selling myself, but I have an initial paper that I'm happy to share. I should make it available. I don't know how, but we'll find a way.
Okay, great, thanks.
Happy to share it.
Maybe you can share in Twitter.
Yeah.
Hashtag the first conduct 22. I'm going to tweet something about you. So.
Yeah.
Yes, go on.
Hey there, Tony.
Hello.
It's Jane O'Loughlin from CERT New Zealand. Thanks for the talk and your
Yeah.
interest in the Pacific. I'm sure you're aware that there's the existing PAXON
Yes.
network, which is made up of Pacific Island nations, including Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of curious as to what you think you could add to that, which is a good collaboration of Pacific nations at the moment, where we're sharing knowledge and
Yeah.
information, and how this would add to that.
So it's a really good question, and I've spoken with Adley and with Clay as well. What I'm trying to do is put a theoretical framework around this. So the work that PAXON's already doing and that engagement, I want to put structure around that and prove that it makes sense. So that CERT New Zealand in particular does brilliant work partnering with Pacific Island nations. But I want to understand and explore what they do and put some structure around that so that you can step back and go, yeah, that's the model and that's what we do, and we can see that this changes and etc. So I want to put some structure around it and offer that then as a model for other parts of the world that have got a similar issue.
Cool. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. It's a very interesting investigation that you're running, and I think that a framework for everybody, for all the islands, and with different techniques, it should not be so easy to design, but I think that they will be benefit with a framework to follow, and it's very important to talk, to have the same languages at least, and set line bases in order to exchange information and to collaborate. Otherwise, everybody is doing whatever, and it's hard to do. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Please give another applause to Tony. Thank you. So we have lunch downstairs. Thank you.
When I got misery, oh,